In today's video, I will show you the top 3 best and highest DPS builds in Diablo 4 Season 5. So, this new season has made some old builds better and some drastically worse. And here are the builds that have been adjusted to fit the Season's 5 new meta, and to get the maximum percentage of every single stat we can. So, if you want to dominate and use builds that can do millions upon millions of damage, speed farm and clear pit 150 and much more, then this is the video for you. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So then moving over to the first build, which is the Lightning Spear Sorcerer. This particular setup is a new build that became possible thanks to the reworked aspect of the splintering energy. This legendary aspect upgrades our Lightning Spear damage by up to 110%, which will be even further increased by our critical strike damage. In the late game, this equates to approximately a 60x DPS boost by getting us tons of CDR from just having equipped 2 specific items. So obviously, with these types of buffs, we will be shredding anyone that comes in our way. Let's start off with the skills, and we will be using the Ice Blades, Teleport, Flame Shield, Unstable Currents, Spark, and of course the Lightning Spear. And for our technique, we have the Ice Blade and Firebolt enchantment. Firebolt is not flashy but extremely useful by giving us access to the Devouring Blaze, Flame Feeder, and damage reduction from burning. And then the Ice Blade enchantment works very well with this build, since we are constantly spamming spells with cooldowns. This gives us couple extra blades, which means more CDR and more damage via the Conjuration Mastery. Overall, this build gets Lightning Spears in 2 ways. First, by casting the spell normally, and second, by proccing it with Unstable Currents. Both methods rely on cooldown reduction, so it is our number 1 priority when we choose what we use. This setup is easy and effective that excels at demolishing large groups of enemies, but we will have to get crit chance up to 100% and stack cooldown reduction until we physically can't stack no more. So then moving over to our skill tree, and this is what we have. And by the way guys, you can find the link to this full build and website guide in this video's description. For this setup to work, you will need to have a level 50 character and have finished the campaign, which is extremely easy to do in the current season. So then in the first section, we spend 2 points to unlock both abilities, the Firebolt and Spark, and then we spend 2 more points to enhance it. Spark skill is our main way of proccing the Unstable Currents. It has reasonably fast animation and gives us much needed critical strike chance. And we just put 1 point into the Firebolt, although we won't use it, just because to get his enhancement. Then we move over to the next section and spend few points to get the Potent Warding and unlock the Charge Bolt skill with 2 enhancements. Again, similar like the Firebolt, although we won't use the skill, we unlock it because of the Destructive Charge Bolt upgrade that helps us reduce incoming damage when we cast the Unstable Currents. Then we move over to the third section and spend a bunch of points for Flame Shield and Teleport. Flame Shield is our emergency defensive button, which we use when we are in danger or when we see a powerful attack is about to come our way. And of course, Teleport makes you unstoppable and is your primary source of mobility. As a bonus, it also procs Unstable Currents. Then the next part is where we spend most of our points to get, most importantly, the Conjuration Mastery and align the elements, as well as unlocking the Ice Blades and Lightning Spear skills. Ice Blades is here to give us cooldown reduction, Conjuration Mastery, and a stack of Tal Razah's Iridescent Loop. Of course, as this build name implies, the Lightning Spear is our main source of damage. Each cast will summon up to 3 Lightning Spears, so like everything else, we wanna spam it as soon as it comes off cooldown. Then after that, we go into one of the last sections to get the Devouring Blaze and Static Discharge. Static Discharge is needed to make the Overflowing Energy passive work, and also to activate the Charge Glyph for the Paragon board. Then in the next section, we unlock the Unstable Currents and spend few points to enhance it, and also get the Electrocution and Hoarfrost passives. Hoarfrost gives us extra damage after we temper the lucky hit, and Unstable Current is another way to generate the Lightning Spears. Unfortunately, it only produces a single spear each time it procs, but we can spam a lot of the shock spells, so then the total output of it becomes insane. And finally, for our key passive, we select the Overflowing Energy. Since all of our damage is coming from shock skills with cooldown, Overflowing Energy is the best key passive for damage despite not having a multiplier. Then next up, let's take a quick look at our gear, and I will show you two setups. The first gear loadout will be a quick 30-second showcase of what you can use immediately with zero grinding required, and then after that I will show you the full endgame setup. So upon finishing the leveling process and approaching the endgame grind, many of the aspects you use are already available to use from the Codex of Power. There's no reason that you shouldn't put them to immediate use, since they can be imprinted as often as needed as you upgrade your gear. So most of our gear will be yellow with few legendary pieces as well. So for chest, gloves, boots and weapon, you can use whatever best you got at this moment. But then for legendary farming pieces, we want to get the aspect of disobedience on the helmet, then aspect of might on pants, then aspect of control on amulet, and finally on both rings, the prodigy's aspect and recharging aspect. This early setup gives us a functional build to begin farming with. With this setup you can farm the legendary aspects you need for the next progression point, which is our insane endgame build. But then when you have a bit of grinding complete, so you get access to at least the hectic aspect and aspect of the orange herald, then now we can look into our fully completed endgame gear. So for the helm we equip the aspect of the orange herald, then for chest armor the aspect of concentration, for gloves the aspect of overwhelming current, for pants we have a unique item, the Tiboltes Will. For boots, another unique item, the Essos Heirloom, and both of these pieces are vital for our build's crazy damage. Then for the weapon we have the aspect of Shredding Blades, and for offhand the Storm of Swell aspect. Then for amulet, the aspect of Splintering Energy. Then for our first ring, we have our last important unique item, the Tal Rasha's Iridescent Loop. And for the second ring, we have the Conceited aspect. Then for gems, on the weapon we use the Emerald for 25% critical strike damage. Then for armor, the Ruby Gem for 9% life. And finally, for all three jewelry pieces, we use the Skull for more increased armor. Then next up, let's go over to the Paragon board. And as there are 225 different choices that I made, so I won't explain each one's reasoning. But most importantly, what you need to know is that this board is optimized to give us as high damage as possible while reducing our cooldowns. So on the starter board, we follow this path and select the Elementalist glyph, which will increase our damage by 5% for every element that we hit on the enemy. Then for the second board, we have the Burning Instinct with the Tactician glyph, which will increase our damage by 10% after we cast a defensive skill for 4 seconds. Then next up we have the Enchantment Master board with the Reinforced glyph. This will give us 15% damage reduction while we have an active barrier. Then the Frigid Fate board with the Charge glyph for 5 to 15% increased damage when we pick up a Crackling Energy. Then now we move to the right side for the fifth board called the Ceaseless Conduct with the Destruction glyph for increased critical strike damage. This buff can stack up to 12%. Then we have the Searing Heat board with the Exploit glyph for increased damage against vulnerable enemies. Then we go back a bit to the 7th board, which is the Elemental Summoner with the Conjurant glyph for increased conjuring skill duration by 20%. And lastly, we go back to the end for Static Surge board with the Flame Feeder glyph for 10% damage increase to burning enemies. And don't forget guys to rotate each board to the right place, so it would look exactly like this setup. And now finally we have come to the last and final part, which is the gameplay and our skill rotations. And as this build is very spammy, so the exact order that you use the spells is not as important as just spamming and stacking all of your damage on top of each other. Like you can see from the gameplay, I activate all of my skills as soon as they're off cooldown. So Lightning Spear is our main source of damage. Each cast summons up to 3 lightning spears. Then the Unstable Currents is another way to generate lightning spears. Unfortunately, it only produces a single spear each time it procs, but we can spam a lot of the shock spells. Then the Spark is our main way of proccing Unstable Currents. It has reasonably fast animations and gives us much needed critical strike chance. Then Ice Blades is here to give us cooldown reduction. Then Teleport makes you unstoppable, and this means that all of the control impairing effects get removed or prevented, so we can constantly keep moving and doing DPS. And this also procs Unstable Currents. And finally we have the Flame Shield, that because of our Paragon board, which gives us more damage right after we use a defensive spell, so no matter if we are taking damage or not, we wanna use the Flame Shield to increase our damage even more for 4 seconds. So in a quick summary, this is the easiest build that you can just spam 24/7 and deal massive amounts of damage, and that's about it. Then next up we have the Bone Spirit Necromancer build. This particular setup was popular in the previous season, but now it is even more OP if you just change few new things. This build right now has the strongest burst damage potential in a single attack. We are talking 11 to 12 digit numbers of damage. Bone Spirit has the largest skill damage multiplier possible in the whole game, and when we prioritize reaching 100% critical strike chance, then the damage from a single Bone Spirit can one-shot a pre-tormented boss. Let's start off with the skills, and we will be using the Blood Mist, Bone Prison, Corpse Tendrils, Raised Skeleton, Decrepify and Bone Spirit. And in the Book of Dead, we have selected the Skeletal Warriors, 2nd Reaper upgrade, then in the Skeletal Mages, the 3rd Bone Sacrifice upgrade, and lastly in the Golems, the 3rd Iron Sacrifice upgrade. Since Bone Spirit deals its damage in a small radius around it on impact, so the entire build is made to pull all enemies together for one big massive AoE shot. By using the Corpse Tendrils, it will apply vulnerable, stun and pull everything to one location, which makes destroying massive amounts of grouped up enemies extremely fast and easy. And when we assemble Exodia in the form of the Banished Lord's Talisman, then you can tap into the Overpower to drastically increase our one-shot potential. By respeccing into new powerful multipliers, maximizing our life with the Fortify and Uniques, including the Blood Moon Breaches, the automatic overpower critical strike damage gets truly insane. So then moving over to our skill tree, and this is what we have. And by the way guys, you can find a link to this full build and website guide in this video's description. For this setup to work, you need to have a level 50 character and have finished the campaign, which is extremely easy to do in the current season. So then in the first section, we spent 2 points on the Bone Splinters. Although we will not use the skill, we just want to unlock it for the enchantment and just to progress to the next part. Then we move over to the next section and spend few points to unlock the Imperfectly Balanced, Unliving Energy and Hewed Flesh. All of these passives will increase our damage, and when we stack a bunch of them together, then you will see how we get these insane DPS numbers. Then next up we move over to the third section and spend few points to unlock the Blood Mist and Bone Prison, and then spend few more to enhance it. Blood Mist is the cornerstone of the build. This gives you full immunity, creates corpses and increases your movement speed, but the Bone Prison is your second on-demand vulnerable. It physically stops monsters from closing the gap and engaging us. It also counts as the 6th minion for the purpose of Requiem, which increases your max essence by 7. Then in the next part we unlock the Decrepify skill and spend few more points to enhance it, and as well to get the Death Embrace and Amplify damage for insane DPS buffs. The Decrepify skill applies a powerful CC effect that also causes a lucky hit proc to reduce the cooldowns of your skills. Then after that we go into one of the last sections, and this is where most of our bulk points will be spent. So we want to unlock the Corpse Tendrils and Bone Spirit, and then most importantly get all of these 3 passives, called Compound Fracture, Rapid Ossification and Evulsion. Like I said in the beginning, the Corpse Tendrils is an amazing CC tool and has the vulnerable effect that makes enemies take 20% increased damage. And of course the Bone Spirit skill is our main damage dealer, that just simply, when we line up everything, we use it to wipe everything on our screen. Then in the next section, we only unlock the Inspiring Leader for increased critical strike chance. And finally for our key passive, we select the Ossified Essence. This is very straightforward. The more essence you have when you cast the Bone Spirit, the more damage it does. So that's why I keep mentioning how important the passives are, and why we want to stack them as much as we can. Then next up, let's take a quick look at our gear, and I will show you 2 setups. The first loadout will be a quick 30-second showcase of what you can use immediately with 0 grinding required, and then after that I will show you the full endgame setup. So upon finishing the leveling process and approaching the endgame grind, many of the aspects you use are already available to use from the Codex of Power. There's no reason you should not put them to immediate use, since they can be imprinted as often as needed as you upgrade your gear. So start off by using easy to get legendaries, like the Aspect of Might on Helmet, Then for chest armor, get the aspect of disobedience. Then for gloves, the edge master's aspect. For pants, the aspect of protector. For boots, the wind striker aspect. For weapon, the aspect of swelling curse. For amulet, the aspect of torment. And for both rings, the requiem aspect and the aspect of grasping veins. This early setup gives us a functional build to begin farming with. The Codex of Power has many damage multipliers available to fill out your imprinted gear, while focusing on the essence management and crowd control leads to the best success in the early game. Your primary concern is being able to generate essence on demand to always be able to cast the Bone Spirit. This becomes significantly easier once you have the Shattered Spirits, but before that, the torment on an amulet to your passive essence generation. Also, a two-handed weapon with the Swelling Curse helps to bring the gap to 100% critical strike chance, which is important for the build to function properly. But then when you have a bit of grinding complete and this build is functioning as it should, then now we can look into our fully completed endgame gear, which is extremely optimized setup. So for the helm, we equip the unique item called the Harlequin Crest. Then for chest armor, get the aspect of hardened bones. Then for gloves, the aspect of serratation. For pants, we want one more unique item, the Blood Moon Breeches. Then for boots, the Path of the Trollghoul. Then for our weapon, we want to use the aspect of Grasping Veins. And for the offhand, the Imprisoned Spirits aspect. Then as far as jewelry goes, for amulet we use the last unique item called the Banished Lord's Talisman. And for both rings, we get the aspect of Torment and Requiem aspect. And then last but not the least, for gems on the weapon and armor, we want to use the Ruby for overpowered damage and life increase. And then for all, so the amulet and both rings, we want to get the Diamond Gem for 8% resistance increase to all elements. And as we use it 3 times, so overall we get 24% resistance to everything. Then next up, let's go over to our Paragon board. And as there are 225 different choices that I made, so I won't explain each one's reasoning. But most importantly, what you need to know is that this board is optimized to give us as high damage by stacking damage increase and crit, while also not making us extremely squishy. So on the starter board, follow this path and select the Amplify glyph for 150% magic bonus, and enemies affected by our cursed skills will take 10% increased damage. Then next up we have the Bone Graft board with the Corporal glyph for infinite uptime 10% damage increase bonus. Then next up we have the third board called the Flesh Eater with the Gravekeeper glyph for 3% damage increase for every close corpse to us, and this can stack up to 6 times. Then we move over a bit to the left and select the Blood Bat with the Essence glyph for 22% damage increase when we damage enemies with our critical strikes. Then next up we have the Cult Leader board with the Dead Riser glyph for 15% increased damage from us and the minions. This will last for 10 seconds. Now we go all the way to the right side and get the Scent of Death board with the Dominate glyph for when you overpower an enemy. All of our damage is increased by 12% for additional 5 seconds. And lastly we go back all the way to the left side and just select the Blood Begets Blood board with these specific nodes. And then finally, we have come to the last and final part, which is the gameplay and our skill rotation. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, our Bone Spirit skill deals its damage in a small radius around it on impact, so the entire build is leveraged to pull everything together for one big massive AoE attack, and this is essentially our gameplay loop every single fight. Managing your resources and cooldowns is also crucial to the success of this build. Each crowd control effect that you inflict upon enemies will trigger the aspect of the Umbral. This means that you can stack multiple crowd control effects in order to get incredible essence generation. And if you really grind in the endgame, then you can even use a non-minion Bone Spirit Necro that will boost this insane damage even a bit more. And this is exactly what you can see from my gameplay. So as far as the rotation goes, in simple words, at the beginning of the fight, we want to get close to the enemies and do starting damage by using the Blood Mist. Then we use Bone Prison, which will physically stop monsters from closing the gap and endangering us. This will also activate the 20% damage buff. Then next up we use the Corpse Tendrils for even more amazing CC. Then the Decrepify, which applies a powerful crowd control effect that also causes Lucky Hit proc to reduce the cooldowns on our skills. And lastly we use Bone Spirit to do the massive damage. So essentially we use Blood Mist to engage/do AoE damage, then Bone Prison, Decrepify and Corpse Tendrils for crowd control stacking, and finally we do insane one-shot damage with a Bone Spear. And then lastly, of course, if you choose to use minions, then always make sure that the maximum number of minions are by your side by activating the Rise Skeleton skill. But if you really grind in the endgame like me and you want to be a bit more riskier by using the same build, just not having the minions option and getting a bit more DPS increase, then you can do that as well. But I really don't recommend it for most players, so stick to the minion setup. And that's about it. And finally, we have the double swing barbarian build. This barb setup is a hard-hitting, fast-paced melee build that excels at all the content that the game has to offer. Its small hit zone may seem underwhelming at first, but once the attack speed buff starts stacking and the blade starts swirling, then the double swing quickly becomes a deadly force, laying a waste to the screens of enemies with its hit and run style of play, while also making short work of any boss that tries to stand in our way. So then let's start with the skills, and we will be using the Rupture, Double Swing, Rallying Cry, Leap, Charge and Wrath of the Berserker. And for our technique, we have the two-handed axe expertise. As for our choice of skills, we focus on abilities that enable us to keep our damage, mobility and fury levels as high as possible. Leap and Charge are great in this regard, since Enhanced Double Swing will always return fury when hitting a stun target. Wrath of the Berserker gives us a massive damage boost and resource regeneration, and of course a nice movement speed boost to go along with it. Rallying Cry is yet another source of recovering our fury, and most importantly, the main source of the Unstoppable, which ensures that any controlled impairing effect does not slow us down. So then let's move over to the skill tree, and this is what we have. And by the way guys, you can find the link to this full build and website guide in this video's description. For the setup to work, you need to have a level 50 character and have finished the campaign, which is extremely easy to do in the current season. So then in the first section, we spend 2 points on the Lunging Strike and Enhanced node. This is required to advance the skill tree. Aside from that, there are benefits to using it in combat, primarily as a fury generation when needed. Then we move over to the next section, and we spend 4 points in the Double Swing, and 2 more points in the enhancements. This skill is our main core ability. It comes packed with some great utility by providing us a way to constantly refresh our berserking status. Anytime it is used against stunned enemies, it even becomes spammable because of the Enhanced Double Swing. And most importantly, this is one of our main ways of spamming the Dust Devils. Then we move over to the third section and spend 6 points on the Martial Vigor and Imposing Presence, while also unlocking the Rallying Cry with 1 point and spending 2 more in the enhanced nodes. The Rallying Cry is our main source of movement speed, source of Unstoppable, Fortify and insane amounts of fury generation. We have this buff active essentially always, thanks to the Yen's Blessing Boots. Then the next part is where the most of our bulk points will be spent, which are to unlock the Leap and Charge skills, while also enhancing them. Charge does quite a few things for us. It is a travel tool, a means of inflicting stun, and a source of Unstoppable and Berserking. It is best to use when approaching groups of spread out enemies, to pack them tightly against walls or terrain, in order to take them out cleanly and effectively. And then Leap is another mobility tool with its own set of advantages. In this setup, we have very low cooldown, and it is typically our main way of getting around quickly. Since Power Leap makes it a fury generation, it will also frequently spawn Dust Devils whenever it lands on enemies. Then after that, we go into one of the last ones to unlock the Rupture, and most importantly, to unlock the Pit Fighter, Slaying Strike, and Counter Offensive nodes. This skill is used for attack speed boost and as a source of guaranteed overpower, which activates the Decimator Paragon node. Then in the next section, we unlock the last skill, the Wrath of the Berserker, and spend few more points in enhancing it. This is a great skill to fall back on when more damage is needed, such as against bosses. And then finally, for our key passive, we select the Walking Arsenal. Then next up, let's take a quick look at our gear, and I will show you 2 setups. The first gear loadout will be a quick 30-second showcase of what you can use immediately with zero grinding whatsoever, and then after that I will show you the full endgame setup. So upon finishing the leveling process and approaching the endgame grind, many of the aspects you use are already available to use from the Codex of Power. There is no reason that you shouldn't put them to immediate use, since they can be imprinted as often as needed as you upgrade your gear. So start off by using the Numbing Wrath, Disobedience, and Shared Misery for your helmet, chest, and pants. Then use Berserker's Ripping, Inner Calm, and Brawlers for gloves and your one-handed weapons. Then for two-handers, use Fierce Winds and Windlasher. Then for boots, amulet, and rings, feel free to equip Anemia, Devilish, Voracious Rage, and Invocalized Empowerment. This early setup gives us a functional build to begin farming with. Some fury issues might be present early on until you find the required gear to solve them. Generally though, Double Swing doesn't suffer much from this problem because we have lower fury cost and we are very self-sufficient. But then on the other hand, when you have a bit of grinding done, then now we can look into our fully completed endgame gear. So for the helmet we equip the Crown of Lucian. Then for chest armor we have the aspect of Bull Katos. Then for gloves, the aspect of Fierce Winds. Then for pants, the Tibalta's Will. Then for boots, the Yen's Blessing. And this is vital, because it will give us an infinite uptime on the Rallying Cry buff. Then for bludgeoning weapon, we get the Airquake aspect. For dual wielding, the Ramaladness Magnum Opus. And for second dual wield, the Third Blade. And these are the last two must-have items as well, as they will enable our build to utilize the Fury to the max potential and give us crazy damage. Then for slashing weapon, we are using the Windlasher aspect, for amulet the Devilish aspect, and for both rings the aspect of Giant Strides and the Starlight aspect. And finally, as for the gems, on weapon we use the Emerald for 25% critical strike damage, then for armor the Ruby for 9% max life, and lastly the Amethyst on our jewelry for the shadow resistance. But what I personally like to do is instead of using 3 amethyst gems on the rings and amulet, I actually just use one type of gem on each piece. So on amulet I use topaz, on the first ring the amethyst, and on the second one the emerald. And this way, no matter who you are fighting, our resistances are spread around, which is very useful when you want to do every single content in the game. And then next up, let's go over to the Paragon board. And as there are 225 different choices that I made, so I won't explain each one's reasoning. But most importantly, what you need to know is that this board is optimized to give us as high damage as possible, while not forgetting about the defenses. So on the starter board, we follow this path and select the Twister glyph. This is vital as our build will be creating Death Devils, so we want to make them as powerful as possible. Then next up we have the Blood Rage board with the Exploit glyph. This will give us massive damage increase to vulnerable enemies. Then the third board is the Warbringer with the Rumble glyph for our Airquake to deal extra damage. But most importantly, we deal 10x more damage to bosses and crowd control enemies. Then the fourth board is the Carnage with the Ambidextrous glyph for increased damage for our one-handed weapons. Then the fifth board is the Bone Breaker with the Territorial glyph. This will give us increased damage to closed enemies. And as we are a melee bruiser, so we will have this buff 24/7. And finally, for the sixth board, we have the Decimator with the Untaunted glyph for increased damage when fortified and some extra damage reductions. And by the way guys, don't forget before spending your points to make sure to rotate the board if needed, so it would 100% align with this setup. And now finally we have come to the last and final part, which is the gameplay and our skill rotations. So at the beginning of the battle we want to use charge or leap, depending on the situation, which will give us berserking. I generally always initiate with leap if possible, to spawn the Airquakes under the targeted area. And if the terrain allows for it, then charge can be aimed at a wall or other obstacles, to first inflict stun and then follow that up with a leap. Then second of all, we shred enemies with the double swing skill, to fill most of our screen with Dust Devils that annihilate everything in their way. Each time we use the skill will also extend the berserking status, even if it does not hit a target, so keep this in mind if it's ever about to fall off. Then the third step is to use Rallying Cry whenever it's off cooldown. While it is on cooldown, it will be cast automatically, right after it falls off, because of the Yen's Blessing. However, if it ever falls off while moving from pack to pack, and there are no targets, then using evade can also activate it. Then next up we use rapture on enemies to gain a huge burst of attack speed and activate the decimator. This should be used depending on the situation and is especially useful in longer fights for maximizing damage. And finally, our route of the berserker is always in our pocket or whenever it's needed. I personally always try to make sure that it's back up in time for boss fights, but keep in mind that this build can be very resource intensive. So resource generation rolls are required on our rings.